been juggling time zones and sorry about that. All right.
No, no problem.
Okay, we are joined live this hour by Christopher Carmona. I'm very, very excited. He's a poet. He's a novelist. He's part of conferences, like all kinds of cultural curator. Just an all around incredible writer. And yeah, so let's get started with how did your writing career, your journey begin? Like, what did you start with? Poetry, stories? I mean, how'd you get into this?
Well, I mean, I've actually always been a storyteller since as long as I can remember, since I was a kid. I actually came into poetry, I guess, late in the game. I came into poetry a little bit in high school, but mostly I started really doing it um, about 13 years ago when I was in grad school. And that's when I really started to take, poetry really seriously. My PhD is partially in poetics. So I've been kind of doing poetry for a long time. But yeah, I mean, so I guess I've always known I was a writer in one shape or another.
Yeah. You went through the PhD program. I've been had the opportunity to speak with many academics, from our
Mhm.
community, who've made it, all the way through higher education. So, in your experience, is higher education racist?
Yes, I mean, no doubt about it. That's part of what I mean. In my program, there was probably, I think, like 53 graduate students. There was
Yeah.
5 Latino students, and we all kind of, that's how we all got to know each other. So the entire program, there was 5 of us, and there was basically two, or I think there was 3 Latino males, and then 2 of us would always be, like they would always mistake one of us for the other, even though we look nothing alike. But that always happened. So yes, the short answer to that is definitely. It's kind of designed that way. I mean, a lot of what I did when I was in grad school was, study. I did a lot of critical race theory work and things like that. Obviously, that's kind of where I got pushed to. I mean, because yeah, it's harder to explain to people who aren't in academia how like really it's such a white space that you really get, you start really looking at what this whole thing is. So, yeah,
Very racist.
definitely.
But I mean,
Yeah.
it starts earlier than that. It starts earlier than PhD programs or master's program. I mean,
Oh,
so
yeah, definitely.
can you tell us about the first time you were kind of punished for being a smart Mexican?
Oh God. That's so when was that? That's a tough one. I'm trying to you're asking like way back when, right?
Like, it'd be like
Yeah, so I can give you a
over
story.
and over again. Yeah.
So I mean, I can give you a story that kind of I guess encapsulates the whole experience, right? So and I'm coming from a place that was like 90%, Latino, right? And I remember I was, like 7 years old, and my parents got called into the principal's office, and I was sitting out there. I had no idea what I had done. Um, and then after that whole meeting, my parents after that just started talking to me purely in English. And before that, they had talked to me obviously in both Spanish and English, right? And so it took me like it wasn't until in my 20s that my father finally told me that that whole meeting was about the fact that I was basically code switching, that I was talking in Spanish and English, and that if I was going to succeed in this country, I had to speak English. And so, and obviously we're looking at the 80s, right? So, my parents did what they thought was best, and they really did that kind of thing. And I didn't really understand it. I didn't know what was going on. I thought I was in trouble, and I think that happens to a lot of people when you get this, you know, and I'm sure it's still happening, right? When you get, punished for speaking Spanish in school. We're talking about the 1980s. We're not even talking about the 60s, right? When it was like, you would get like the dunce cap and everything, and all this like spanked for speaking Spanish. It was still happening, and that was one of the first times. When you fast forward a little bit, is really in like looking at high school and wanting to go to places like I wanted to go to NYU, and I wanted to go to like maybe Berkeley or something, and I wanted to go to these different places, and the counselors are telling you should really think about technical schools, right? Um, so when we think about the education system, and like, I was interested in, things that, that were not technical. I wanted to really study and go to college, and that's kind of a systematic thing, right? Where they just kind of they don't really. I mean, it's so like ingrained the racism that they don't realize that they're just pushing you off into these jobs that were always been relegated for Latinos, for people of color, right? And so those kind of things have always been there, right? And especially when they, like when you go into like even my undergrad experience, and wanting to I mean, we had only this is like a university that was pretty much like 80% Latino. They only had one Chicano history course, and then and so wanting to learn more about that always graded up against the system, right? And so there's all those kind of experiences. I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, it does.
those are my
It seems like so oftentimes we experience education either as like this direct abuse or like some type of civilizing mission or something like that. It's like it's not really it's not designed for us to express ourselves in the way we want to express ourselves at like a
yeah.
I mean obviously, going to school is theoretically a good thing. You sit down, you develop your mind,
Mhm.
you really think, you really like, challenge yourself. But for us, when we enter it, it's like, here's how you be smart. Like, look at all these people. None of them look like you. Don't bring up people that look
Mhm.
like you. And that's
Yeah.
one way of doing it. That seems to be over and
Oh
over and
yeah.
over again in these interviews. I've talked to people, and this is what they've described. And did you have a similar experience?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, also they don't really push like, oh, you should go to Harvard or you should go to all these places. It's mostly like, especially obviously we're looking at you know, the 80s and 90s, like, going to technical schools, it wasn't pushed like, oh, you should really think about, you should really go to an Ivy League school, right? So I think it's probably a different experience for white students, right? Like, oh, you can go to Harvard. Right? That was never told to me, right? When I was there. I tell my students that all the time, though. Like, you can do it. Any one of you can go and you can get a PhD. Nobody ever told me I could, right? It was just not something that you should be a plumber or you should be a mechanic or something, right? All those different things, and they never really talked to you about being going into higher education. I
Yeah.
like to go and yeah.
So now that you've gone through this process, you went and got your PhD, you did this thing that like we're told we can't do.
Mm,
You speak to students, speak at high schools, speak to
yeah.
the younger generation. How do they respond seeing someone like you? Looks like they could be like their older cousin or their uncle or something like that, telling them like you can do it too. What's the interaction like?
I mean, what's strange is I usually get it more from the parents.
Mm,
Like the parents will come up to me and say, "We want you to talk to our students again. We want you to talk to our son again or our daughter because nobody's ever told them that before." Like what you're saying is like I can't. I usually tell them like I came from the same place you did, right? I came from the same body as you did, and if I can do it, you can do it. And I think that like in schools will always invite me back because I tell the students that. The kids themselves. I think that it's just hearing that from someone who came from the same space that they came from. I have students that who've contacted me and told me that they went to they want to go on, they want to do more stuff, they want to go to college, they want to do all this. I think it's the fact that somebody actually tells them that they can when I never got that, right? So I think just by hearing that, it gives them an opportunity to like. There's like a light bulb that goes off in some of these kids that they can do it, and it's just so. I mean, the kids will start to light up. Some of them, obviously not all, right? Because you're dealing with high school kids, but some of them do, right? And some of them get really excited.
yeah. I know you're heavily involved in the Rio Grande Valley, the poetry scene and the writing scene in general. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the really vibrant writing scene that's out there in the Rio Grande Valley?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in. I mean, it's kind of come in different waves. Like back in when I first started working in back in the '90s, it was kind of a small scene. But really, since about, I would say 2010, 2011, somewhere around there, it's really exploded. There's a lot of different poets and writers out here. And and the fact that that they've had this the Valley National Poetry Fest and things like that happening. We hosted things like Sin Fronteras Book Festival, and we always get tons of people coming out. There is like this. There's always been writers here, and we also get a lot of cross-border writers, right? Mexican writers who come to this side of the border, and we all kind of know each other, and it's so it has been a lot. There's a lot of great writers who are here. We were talking earlier about Edward Vidaude, and we were talking about friends of mine like Mario Ortiz, who's is just from here, and we have lots of different people that obviously some of the more famous people like Lorenzo Dua, Americo Paredes are from the Valley originally. So there's a lot of those, mentors that we have here. And I find it strange because I work in Brownsville, and it's the only town I've seen that has street names named after writers. Like they have Americo Paredes Boulevard, this line. It's like he was a Chicano writer. He has a name.
Yeah,
He's got an elementary school, right? You don't usually see that kind of thing. So there is like a pride of that. And then, having that kind of legacy and with the writers here, there are a lot of writers, and we're always trying to, there's always more coming up and always meeting new people.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I'm originally from Los Angeles, but I live in
Hmm.
California and I go up to the Bay a lot. And up there, the kind of idea, of concept of like this is like the home of the beats, or like there are
Hmm.
people,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
LA, but New York as well, but like that, the kind of seeing that bi-coastal thing, right? But you refer to yourself as a Chicano beat poet, and you also talk about some kind
Yes.
of Texas beat. Can you explain to
Yes.
our audience what both those things mean?
So the Chicano beat poet, one of my mentors was my Raul Salinas, who was an Austin-based poet. He opened back in the '80s. He started a bookstore, which is still alive today, called Resistencia. And when I lived in Austin back in the early 2000s, when I first really kind of met him, and Raul referred to himself as a beat poet. And that's when I first got introduced to the beat poets, not just the main three, which are usually the main three white guys, which are like Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs. But he introduced me to a whole world of people of color who were beats. And basically, what that means is the way Raul kind of talks about it is people that write from a very different perspective, where there's kind of like the outliers, the weirdos, who are within like being, you're still Chicano, but you're also writing about things that like sci-fi stuff, and like Reyes Cardenas writes about, which is like this offbeat kind of stuff, but we kind of bring it in, and you're able to have this kind of um, different perspective where it's very beat, right? And when he talks about beat, it's not, it's really about this kind of undercurrent, underrepresented type of writing that doesn't follow the trends, right? That's out there. And then, yeah, a lot of it comes from California, right? And then you talk about San Francisco, City Lights Books. If you actually go into City Lights Books, they have like a lot of Latino authors
Mhm.
on the shelves
Yeah,
because
yeah,
there was a lot of Latino authors involved in the movement that you just don't hear about because you just mostly hear about the main three, right? But there was actually a lot, and I learned a lot of this from our Raul Ricardo Sanchez, who's mostly known for you have to not devour him, but he wrote a lot of different stuff, and so for me, like I really identify with what Raul taught me, and he was really a mentor of mine as a poet. Um, and so, he really brought me into this whole thing of how to really incorporate culture, how to incorporate all these different aspects of who you are, and it's okay, right?
yeah.
You don't have to adhere to specific boundaries, right?
Right, right. Well, can you tell us a little bit more about, tell our audience, it's a wide cross section of people, not everyone's a poet. So can you tell us a little bit more about Raul and who he was and what his legacy was, and just how
So,
he
yeah.
moved?
So Raul Salinas was a Chicano beat poet, a Chicano poet from Austin, and he when in his youth he spent a lot of time, in prison. But he was in prison in places that especially in the 50s and 60s, when you had a lot of political prisoners, which is where he got politicized, right? Where he really became political. Before that, he talks about himself as basically being this kind of Pachuco type of guy. But then he got into prison. He was hanging out with people like George Jackson and all these people, and it really opened his eyes to what is happening, the idea of the system, and so he really educated himself. And so when he came out, And he came, you know, first he was living amongst the Native American population up there in like Oregon and Washington area, and he really got schooled in the you know Native American indigenous thought, and he brought all that back to Austin, and so he became you know a pretty huge cultural center. When he opened his bookstore Resistencia, and his books, you know, obviously Trip to the Mine Jail is probably one of his most famous book. Um, and then he's got like was it the chicken the well East of the Freeway, which he calls his beat book, talking about growing up on the east side of Austin. It's got all this mixture of like jazz and being talking about him being basically this criminal, but not really this kind of underclass type of person. But Raul did. When with his bookstore, with his outreach, he worked a lot with the community. He worked a lot with juveniles, and he taught them poetry. He really went on to the community and helped people. And he was one of the key people that told me, calling yourself Chicano, it's actually about practice, right? It's not about the image. Like, what are you doing to help your community? What are you doing to give back? And so Raul, Resistencia is a key example of that and keeping that going. But for me, he was really one of the key Texas Chicano poets, along with people like, Ricardo Sanchez and, Tomas Rivera, who obviously he was mostly known as California, but he comes from Texas.
I
Yeah, I didn't know that either. So I was talking to Raul. It's like he's actually from Texas. John Ritchie out of El Paso. All these guys, and then there's a lot of women involved in this movement too that I got to know through all this connections. But Raul was, he was one of my mentors. He really taught me a lot about poetry and how to really bring this stuff in. So
yeah.
and I know there's a friend of mine who's making a documentary on Raul.
Yeah.
And so she's putting together, so getting to know who he is and really bringing him out, and why he's so important is a key thing.
Yeah. Can you tell?
I think.
Yeah. Can you tell us about Reyes Cardenas?
So Reyes is interesting. He's still writing. He writes like I love his stuff because it's so off beat, right?
Yeah.
He writes about like poems about pencils. He writes poems about aliens, and Reyes is like he's not an academic at all. He's actually a machinist. Like he's still working as a machinist in like factories and stuff, and so he's like a real working class type of you know. Oh yeah, so Juan just chimed in, but
this is my interview.
Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah, so Reyes is a really cool guy, but his stuff is really offbeat. I love his stuff because he's very different.
Yeah.
But yeah, he writes about all this. If you read his stuff, it's really offbeat type of stuff. But yeah, Reyes is he's still out there. He's still reading. I just saw him.
Yeah.
Well, like a few months ago, before obviously we're locked down, but out in San Antonio, and he's still out there doing these type of readings. And to bring in Juan Tejeda published a collection of his writings through his Atlan Libre Press.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about Juan Tejeda.
So Juan and I go back. So he wants me to talk about the fight. So we've been working with the Fighting for Mexican American Studies and Ethnic Studies in Texas. I guess we're going on 6 years now. This fight. So Juan and I have been working together a long time. Juan is known, primarily as a musician in his own right, but he's also a publisher. He does the Cajonito Festival and all these different things. And, and so we've been working, but he's also an educational activist, like I'm an activist, and we've been working through National Association of Chicano and Chicano Studies, that has FOCO chapter. We've worked on bringing Mexican American Studies into the public schools here in Texas. And last year, we got the first Mexican American Studies course approved by the Texas State Board of Education. First one ever. So that was a huge accomplishment. We're talking about Texas here, right? And they approved it.
Congratulations. Can you tell?
Go ahead.
That brings to mind. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the textbook that came out that was so controversial that they were trying to ram through?
Yeah, so that was the textbook itself was the beginning of the fight in a lot of ways, because I think it was, man, we're talking about 2013, around that time, 2014, when we had a state board representative, Ruben Cortez, who came onto the board, and he proposed the Mexican American Studies course. But this is Texas, and and so what they told him basically is they would allow him to open up a call for a textbook, which, you know, and one of the entry we got was this book called Mexican American Heritage, which was written by Cynthia Dunbar, who, if you, there's a documentary out there called The Revisionaries,
Hmm.
and she was one of the people that headed up the cause to change the whole social studies critique. You know, she's a huge Trump supporter. She's so, they're changing all the requirements for the social studies. Bringing in like Moses and things like that, removing Thomas Jefferson and all these different people from the textbooks, minimizing people of color. All that happened, right? So this is the woman who decided to put together this textbook called Mexican American Heritage, right? And so when that got submitted, obviously it raised red flags. Like, we know who's behind this. Like, this is so. We were commissioned, Juan and a bunch of us were asked by Ruben to look this book over. And I think we found somewhere about 350 just regular factual errors in the book. But obviously, my job on this was to kind of look at the rhetoric of what was going on with this and the way that there was like the sources they were using were clearly people like Samuel P. Huntington, which is a known
Jesus.
like white supremacist.
Professional
Yeah.
racist, yeah.
White supremacist. Yeah.
I mean, in
So
Huntington's defense,
it
he was a
was
very
that.
successful professional racist. Like he was a very
Yes,
prominent white supremacist.
that's true. He taught at Harvard.
Yeah.
He was publishing The Economist. I mean, this is a guy which, if you're not paying attention to what he's writing, people believe him. And it's like, but he was like, you read his stuff, like the Hispanic Challenge, right? Which is
Yeah.
Hispanics are taking over the country and creating two different, all this kind of stuff. That's him, right? Clash of Cultures is very anti-Islamic, right? Um, it's like deeply, anti-Islamic, very racist. But it's used, right? It's used like, oh, this is a great book. It's like, really, it is. If you read Orientalism, by
Yeah.
by Edward Said, it's like this is everything he's talking about. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. But yeah, so this book that she put together, um, so we were basically fought against that book and got it thrown out. And it took a lot of organizing. It took a lot of people. And I mean, we put out so many reports and responses to this textbook to get it thrown out, and we were successful, but it took us another 4 years to get this class going, right?
Yeah.
So, well, that was the beginning of the fight to get the class made, because that's a perfect example of why we need ethnic studies, right? That book is like, this is why we need this class, because
Yeah.
this stuff is still being, you know, written
Yeah.
about us.
So I think but it's interesting you talking about Samuel Huntington because Samuel Huntington, his final book was that book like Who Are We? Challenges to
Yeah,
American.
that's right.
And so I've read parts of it, and it kind of seems to me like there's a pretty straight line from Who Are We to Adios America by Ann Coulter.
Yeah,
Which is
that's
more like
definitely true.
a trashy
They
version of
all,
yeah.
yeah, they all use him as like their main go-to scholar. Like all of them. If you look at all of those, that type of conservative type of writing, Samuel P. Huntington's going to pop up in every single one of them.
Yeah.
And he's really kind of their go-to, right? He's like their Du Bois or something.
The soul of
Yeah.
racists.
Yes.
Yeah. So then there's a pretty straight line between Adios America and the speeches, the 2016 presidential campaign of Donald
Hmm.
Trump. I mean, like he
Yeah.
was lifting a lot of what he said directly out of Ann Coulter's book, and Ann Coulter
Yes.
essentially popularized the arguments made in Who Are We?
Yes. Correct. Because I mean, because Huntington was a scholar, so I mean, most people are not going to really know who Huntington is unless you're really following that kind of work. And you get someone like Ann Coulter, who's just a personality, right? And she's able to really amplify that kind of message, right? And that's obviously the danger of those. I mean, those pundits, right? And those like. they're not really intellectuals, but they're able to amplify it and write these books, and because they're always on TV, right? So they've got to be. That's part of the rhetorical strategy, right? Get them seen as much. That means they're an expert, right? If you're on TV,
Right.
and the way that the arguments are always is presented, like even in the mainstream media is at fault for this, but you always have like, here's this one scientist who doesn't believe like in global warming, and here's the one who does, right? But if you look at the actual argument, it's like 99%. There should be 99 scientists and this one guy, right? That's the way it should actually look. But when we put them side by side, it looks like that's giving them a credence on the same level, and that's what the uncultured does, right? Is that really her ideas are very, very, fringe, but because they give her such a voice, it makes it seem like more people actually believe this kind of stuff.
Right,
And
right.
that's just the way it works. But yeah, I
So,
mean, you have to be like vigilant about that stuff. Yeah.
so how come you're not on television debating Ann Coulter? Why, or how come if everything's supposed to be 50-50, how come none of us are ever on TV? What's going on here?
Because it's
Why?
not 50-50. Yeah, I think it's something like 99% of media is white, so it's pretty high. So yeah, we don't. It's not an even playing field at all.
Mm,
And we get what Eric Miles Dyson. That's about it, right? We get it like what Cornell West, and that's a couple of representatives if we're lucky. But that's usually what we get.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really interested is looking at specifically at our community, how we are facing this thing of we're facing these two things right now. We're facing misrepresentation and we're facing
Yes.
underrepresentation, and we're facing them simultaneously. So sometimes when we want to fight that battle of underrepresentation, we will misrepresent ourselves. We will, oh, well, like if something's better than nothing, and so you end up
Hmm.
on television like Speedy Gonzalez or something. So like,
Yes. Exactly.
how do we fight this underrepresentation in a dignified manner?
Well, I mean, this kind of leads into kind of what I'm trying to do with my work, right? Um, so one of the main things um, with what I'm doing right now, because primarily, I mean, I've been writing poetry, but mostly currently I'm working on this series of young adult novels. Um, and so, I made the mistake of signing a 4-book contract. And I was all excited about it. And then I realized I have to write 4 books. Right? It was like, oh my God, I just committed myself to this. Um, and yeah, it sounds great, right? Like, I'll get a 4-book contract. I mean, it's so good. And then, like, oh, wait a minute. No, I actually got to do it. But so what these series is really does that exactly that. So um, I have a character that what I'm trying to do is one of the things is right now one of the most prominent forces in media or in Hollywood or really anywhere right now is superheroes, right? Superheroes are everywhere. And you have like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you have the DC one, and they're all hugely popular. And like they're pretty much the bulk of what was coming out in theaters for a long time, right? But if you watch all these movies, which I'm a huge sci-fi, all that kind of stuff. I watched them all. Like, how many Latinos were in these things, right? Like most people can't name. They're like, and these are like huge movies, right? They made like 20 of them or something so far. It's like, and how many Latinos do we have? We basically have Michael Pena in Ant-Man, right? And he's
Yeah.
not really a superhero; he's just a character, even though he's my favorite character in that whole thing. But um, that's it, right? We don't have any superhero representation. In comic books, they're doing more, right? But that's so far under the radar because really the biggest transmitter of this type of stuff is the films, right? Films and television. And all the Netflix shows, even like all that stuff, they have like a lot of TV shows very underrepresented. I mean, I can't think of one that I've seen in the major films that are Latino, right? I think there is one on like Agents of Shield, and they call her Yo-Yo. That's the only one I can think of at this point. Um, but
Yo-yo.
so that was what was her name?
A yo-yo.
Yo-Yo. That's right.
I'm sorry, come on.
That's
I just read. Go on. Okay.
yes. So Yeah, because she's like the speedster in the group or something. But anyway,
Speedy Gonzalez.
she's the only Latina.
Speedy Gonzalez.
Yes.
What did I say? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we get all that, right? And then, so yeah, I mean, you look at it, and then there are some, right? You have Miles Morales, who's probably the most famous, because he's, he was in the Spider Verse one, um, and um, and most people can name him. Usually, when I go talk to kids about this stuff, they'll usually name Miles Morales because that's the only one that they really know. If I'm lucky, they'll do like, Robbie Reyes, who's Ghost Rider. Um, and then you have, Jaime Reyes, who's the Blue Beetle, which is rarer. And then Jessica Cruz, who's the new Green Lantern, and that's about it. And that's like four. So I actually did research, right? Looking up, like, all right, how many Latinos are actually comic book heroes or superheroes? And there is very, very little compared to how much we have. Um, so yeah, I mean, when we look at that, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a character um, that was a positive influence because the subject matter of these young adult novels is something that is historical. Actually, that's something that happened in our history. Um, it's something called La Matanza. And La Matanza was a time period. They usually put it between 1910 and 1920. Me, I put it around 1905 because the first major incident happened around that time, but they usually put it between those years. Here in the Rio Grande Valley or South Texas, um, so South Texas is a very different history than most of the country. Um, this area was pretty much left alone by the U.S. and Mexico for a long time because it was considered undesirable land. So there's lands, which was, northern Mexico, Tamaulipas, into South Texas now, um, was run by five major Mexican families who were basically Spanish land grant families. There were families like the Baillis and the Cavazos and the Garces, and actually there was two Bailli families, but there's a whole thing there. And but there was these five major families that kind of ran everything from basically south of Corpus to Christi to about where Monterrey is, and there was a long, because Spanish land grants, they give them like millions of acres, right? And they were basically left alone for a long period of time, looking like 300 years. But what happens when you get to the turn of the century and 20th century is the economy for the U.S. shifts dramatically to agriculture, mass production of agriculture. And we're looking at the early in the 1910s, which is going to lead into World War One and eventually World War Two. So in 1904, the railroad is connected, and that's when brings down all of these things to this area, and they're looking to really kind of, as Benjamin Johnson refers to it, he's one of the major scholars here, the last colonization of the U.S. mainland. And what happens is they first try to buy these people out, and obviously they're not selling because they've had these ranches. They're also very wealthy. They're very well educated peoples. Um, and they've actually had these ranches in their family for hundreds of years, so they're not going to sell. So they go back to the governor, and they're saying, there's no way, we can't get this land because these people are not going to sell. So he basically lends out the Texas Rangers. He says you can use the Texas Rangers in any capacity, and whatever they do, they will not be prosecuted. So he basically also offered them a pre-pardon, in which we found the letters to back this up. Right? Yeah, actually, Dewar said this, and that's what opened up the gates to the massive amount of killings of Mexican Americans and for really about 10 years, pretty much straight through. And they estimate, the problem with the numbers is that most of the people that were killed were not issued death certificates. So the actual numbers of people are pretty much open, but they estimate anywhere to about 5,000 people were massacred during this time. And a lot of the stories I heard personally from my grandfather who lived during this time. And when I heard these stories growing up, I didn't really, square them with a lot of what was going on because I grew up watching westerns and things like this too, like the Lone Ranger and all this stuff, right? Like Walker Texas Ranger and all these things. But I grew up watching like Clint Eastwood and all these things, all this John Wayne type stuff. And when you're watching those as a kid, and then like hearing the stories that my grandfather used to tell, those two things never came together as the fact that the people that they're killing in these westerns are us,
Yeah.
are Mexicans, are Indians, right?
Mhm.
And they're always the bad guys. And that has not really changed, right? So if somewhere, I forgot when it was, the new Lone Ranger movie came out with Johnny Depp,
Yeah.
and he's not Native American, so just want
Billionaire.
to make that clear. And so he's playing this caricature of a Native American, right? Dressed in this really, you know, oh my God, I don't know how to say it, but it's basically this caricature of a Native American, this stereotype with all the makeup and everything, and they're representing, you know, the same the same story of these Rangers that were not true. The Texas Rangers were terrorists. They're considered the KKK of Latinos in this area, right? People they were, I mean, they call them Rinches because it comes from what they used to call them, pinches Rinches, right? Because in Spanish they have that lyrical kind of thing, right? So Texas Rangers became Rinches, but they were pinches Rinches, right? And that's kind of how they got their name. So these stories, like when I saw this movie, I was like, you know what? Nobody knows these stories. And I was talking to people, I was talking to actually a graduate student in Chicano Studies at UCLA. She had never heard these stories. So I was like, so now as a writer, it's my responsibility. I have to tell these stories because not even people that grew up here in the Rio Grande Valley know these stories. So I started my research. And when I started doing research, I found it wasn't anywhere in any of the history books. None of this stuff was there. And so I started working with a group of historians. They call themselves the Refusing to Forget Project, and there's basically there's five of them, and they're the ones who've dedicated their careers to uncovering this history. Um, I mean, the lynchings, the stories that I heard, because I did a lot of oral history work from children of these people, from descendants of people who were murdered, and there's a lot. And then the one major document that we have is in 1919. Um, J.T. Canales, who was the only Mexican American legislature at the time, commissioned a hearing on the activities of the Texas Rangers. Over 300 people testified against the Texas Rangers, and most of them came from South Texas. This document, we did not get access to this document. Well, first it was actually released in the 1970s, but nobody really got access to it. I mean, there was some, but it wasn't until 2016 that we actually got to see it. And it's like 1,000 pages worth of stuff, and all these stories that are written and like people were testifying at the time are the same stories that people were telling me when I was interviewing them for oral history. And so, getting these stories out. But one thing I didn't want to do with these books is I didn't want to create it. I didn't want to write a tragedy. I wanted to create a positive figure because you're right, we are underrepresented in the hero factor. And during this time, you had corridos were the way that these stories were told. And corridos, we're talking about way before narco corridos ever existed, right? These are the original, where corridos were about folk heroes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
People who fought against injustice and became this kind of larger than life superhero figures. Americo Paredes writes about this, like with his pistol in his hand, and and things like this, where he talks about, and this is the way that we got our stories out through the corridos. And so there was these people that were written about, like Anastasia Pezaña, Jacinto Trevino, and all these people who are the reason that we know about them. Well, I know about them is because of these songs, right? That were written about them and they were passed down because they're not in the history books the same way. Um, and so this is one of the things I want to do. I wanted to create a character. And so in response to the Lone Ranger movie, then in response to what's happening now, I created one. I created this character, which I called El Rinche, who is basically a light-skinned Mexican American whose family is massacred and he's left for dead, and he gets picked up by basically Native American and someone who was a real person, um, called Bass Reeves. If Bass Reeves is the most successful lawman in U.S. history, he was African American Marshal, and he is the guy who the Lone Ranger is based off of. The original, from the 1920s radio show, 1920s, 1930s, Bass Reeves was the Lone Ranger.
Yeah.
And everything you get about him, his life, is what comes on the Lone Ranger. So when I was doing research on this, and the reason I found out about Bass Reeves, kind of a side note, I was at an art show. I saw this massive painting of this guy named Bass Reeves, and then the piece was called "The Real Lone Ranger." So that's when I started doing research, and I found out who he was.
Yeah.
But so Bass Reeves, I bring into my story, the first book, and he helps train the character, and then and so to also get that history out. He was the most successful lawman in U.S. history. He arrested over 3,000 people. You know, he was like in 14 gun battles, and he never got shot. Well, that's what they say, but he actually did get shot. That was kind of the myth. And this is a guy who we should all know about. He helped train Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. He was a pretty successful lawman. He was really, all the things you know about the Lone Ranger come from his life. So I wanted to bring that into this. So I have a lot of things that kind of collide in these novels.
Yeah.
The Japanese were actually a huge part of Rio Grande Valley history. Um, and so the Japanese had two major colonies here. They were also attacked and terrorized by the Texas Rangers. And so I bring them in. So I was able to give my character ninja powers. Um, and this whole organization, is basically a group of people who are starting this kind of quest to help fight the Texas Rangers during this whole time. So I bring in real history coupled with this kind of fantasy of a
Yeah.
superhero type of character. So that's what I've been working on. So it's not just, for me, it's about representing this history, but also bringing in a positive character. And when I go, what's really interesting is the best response I've gotten from the first book is from historians and from comic book people. When I go to do like Comic Cons, and they tell them this isn't a graphic novel, it's a novel, but they love it. They love this because there's not a lot of representation, right, of Latinos, um, and so I think that's, for me, this is why I do this work, right? I
Yeah.
want to bring this out, and I also want to have a positive image.
Yeah.
I know that was a long description, but
Well, what it made me think about is here in California, like one of the big folk heroes is Joaquin Murrieta, right? Uh,
yes.
and so that's like, I mean, like, so every time you're talking about, I'm like, oh, it's like Murrieta or Vasquez,
hmm
the other.
Well, Joaquin Murrieta is basically the archetype for Batman,
Yeah.
because it goes from Joaquin Murrieta to Zorro, Zorro to Batman, right? So Batman's always been Chicano, right?
Yeah, Chicano Batman is redundant. I don't even know what they're.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about that though is like, because I thought a lot about that too. But the reality is that Joaquin Murrieta, the man is shrouded in myth. Who was this guy? This, that, the other. But what is a fact is that the California Rangers tracked down somebody who they claimed to be Joaquin Murrieta, chopped off that guy's head, and put that head in a jar. Kept that head in a jar in San Francisco until the earthquake, knocked everything down. And then that becomes reimagined as Zorro, and then that becomes reimagined as Batman. So it's like it's one thing to the next. And so when I think about like a lot of these westerns, I think about things like the Wild Bunch, right? So I think the Wild Bunch is something that is like, okay, that's the Mexican expedition. That's like John Pershing going down and shooting a bunch of Mexicans, and then like now you're reimagining it as like these like kind of white vigilante guys going into Mexico, shooting a bunch of Mexicans and like saving the Mexicans from themselves. So this goes to the question of like underrepresentation, misrepresentation, that we're always either criminals or the victims of crime, in need of white intervention, right?
Yes.
And this is how they portray us.
Well, I mean, look at the latest Rambo movie, which is exactly that. It's horrible because it's exactly that. First, it's like, obviously Rambo's like adopted daughter is a victim of crime of a cartel, right? So he has to take out the entire cartel. And so you have both ends of that, right? It's like, so who has to solve this problem, right? This old white guy, right? And so, yeah, those kind of stories are still dominating. They're still dominating the popular culture. And so, I mean, that's part of what I want to do is try to bring more Latino characters, right?
People more subtle, like take the ones where you kind of like it, you're kind of like what I don't know. Like look at the new Terminator reboot, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, it's kind of cool. It's kind of interesting. Okay, she's a savior. That's cool. But at the same time, like, wait a minute. you're coming here to save the. I recognize what this is. You're saving the señorita from the bad hombre. That's what's going on right now.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
like it's not. I don't have a problem with Mexican dude being a villain. I mean, there's some real villains
Yeah,
amongst them. But then make like the fucking the savior Mexican too. Like let's keep it
yeah,
all Mexican. Don't.
yeah. So, like in the first book, I think that all the villains are white guys. Well, there are some like I guess
Treacherous.
what they call Malinche. What they have a term for them here called quinyeños because they're like Mexican peoples that work for the King Ranch. So the King Ranch obviously were one of the major perpetrators of killing a lot of Mexican ranchers and Mexican peoples. And so there were families that were like working for them, and they got this nickname, which is like Malinche, right? Or Benedict Arnold, which is Quinyeños. And if you're called a Quinyeño, it was obviously an insult.
Right.
So without interrupt, so there were people who helped them, right?
Right.
Basically, they're considered traitors to their own, to the people that are getting massacred, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. It's complicated. It's never simple. But if we didn't have this influence of American corporations, American ranchers, white Anglo ranchers wanting to take these lands from these Mexicans, then these people, But yeah, who do you hear about? You hear about them all more than like the Kings, but the Kings were pretty horrible.
Yeah.
They were pretty bad, and yeah, I mean, I think we don't have enough, but yeah, all of that. I mean, how much where we have like strong Latino lead males, right? We don't have. I can't think of anything right now.
No,
Maybe the Chicano movie, but that's got its problems.
it's Mexicanos, but like, no, I agree with that. But yeah, but it's always like the Clint Eastwood movie. You know what's really upsetting is these boxing movies. Like 90% of boxing movies are white. Like what world
Yeah,
is like what?
yeah,
Like
it's true.
1990 never for that to, but not even like
I know. Most of them are Mexican American or Mexican boxers that are winning the world championships. I mean, it's like when was the last time a white guy won a boxing championship? I don't remember.
well,
But yeah,
they got Eastern Europeans now, but it's never Eastern European. It's always like this white guy from Hell's Kitchen that no longer exists, right? So
yeah,
you look at all the boxing
exactly.
episodes, like most of them are like black fighters from the Midwest or Philadelphia or Mexican fighters, or Puerto Rican
Yeah,
fighters, or like not these guys.
yeah, yeah. Like Daredevil should have been Puerto Rican or he should have been black.
Yeah.
Hell's Kitchen is not a white neighborhood in New York. It's like, okay, the only white guy in there gets superpowers.
One white man in hell, or Ant.
Yeah,
He should have been black or Chicano.
yeah,
Like the Pig
yeah,
should have been Ant Man.
yeah, that's true.
Oh,
But of course, this is Hollywood, right?
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, even the movie they did with Roberto Duran, the movie made about Roberto Duran, the Panamanian.
Oh, yeah,
But the commercials were all about Robert De Niro. The commercials are all about his trainer.
yeah,
That was disgusting. I didn't even go see the movie because the commercial told me it was going to be about the trainer. It was like, one man trained another man.
yes. What's interesting about that is I saw the movie and you're right. It was all really about Robert De Niro's character and how he was able to redeem himself by taking on this what was he, Panamanian, or I forget what kind of yeah. I was like, okay, yeah, we'll take that. But yeah, so that happens, right? Because they need to have the white savior in there. That's also a white savior movie.
So Roberto Duran's considered like the best lightweight of all time, one of the like best 5 fighters ever
Hmm.
lived. He's one of the greats, right? And even then, it's a movie about his trainer. I mean, what the fuck are we talking?
Yeah,
Horrible. All right, so
I know.
we got a question from the audience.
Sure.
I asked, it's kind of 3-part. Same here. I once asked characters from Marvel. Once asked about what characters from Marvel, DC, indie comics have a Latino cult following, like Panther and KG for Black folks. I asked the same for Asians. But actually, plenty of characters created the same universe a good while back, but neither Latinos nor Asians had anyone they gravitated to. Do you find the same problem in animated live action, or no character in the franchise has a Latino cult following?
Well, the problem I think we have is there's no real superheroes that are, we have. I mean, like, when you think of like even like black superheroes, Black Panther's the only one that we have this kind of following with, right? I mean, like there's our others. Like, what about Blade? What about There are other black characters, but for some reason we only and then also Black Panther was written by two white guys. It was created by two white guys, and yet we have this huge following. So, but I think it's because it was like all black director, all black cast, right? Because before that, Black Panther wasn't really that big of a character in the Marvel scene, right?
Or,
He was there, but he's like, he didn't really have a huge following like, Iron Man or Wolverine or any of these guys or the X-Men, right?
yeah,
And so we don't have a real good like representation of an Asian character or a Latino character that I can really think of. I know they're trying to now with like they're going to do like the Ten Rings thing or something, bringing in like the first like Asian American superhero. Um, and maybe that'll work, but I never heard about that comic until I heard that they were going to make this movie, right? Um, and like, and I look through a lot of these comics and I try to find stuff, right? And there are indie comics. Like one of the best, it's really weird. There are things like I've been to like Latino Comic Cons,
mm,
um, and things like this, and you get to see like a lot of these indie ones.
yeah,
Um, but they don't get the same type of like distribution as the mainstream comics do, right? But
yeah,
there are some really good stuff out there. Like some of the great stuff I've seen came out of the Indigenous Comic Con in Albuquerque, and they had things that were really great comics. Um, and and also the Indigenous Comic Con has a lot of Latinos in part of it as well. So, but there are a lot of them are, you know, um, there are basically underrepresented. They're not distributed. They're not promoted as widely. Um, there was that show that I think it was called The Gifted on FX, which actually had a lead who was who was Native American. He was Thunderbird, and Thunderbird in the Marvel and the X-Men comics was always kind of the smaller character. But in this show, they made him the kind of a lead, but he was marginalized a lot. Even though he was the leader of the group, the stories were never really about him. But he was like the leader. Usually the leader is supposed to get like, the biggest praise, but it's really about the two white kids that they rescue and then becomes kind of their story. But he was like that character should have been the lead. He should have been because he was the leader of the group. So why isn't he not getting as much play, right?
yeah,
And so a lot of this, and so I
yeah,
think it's basically because they haven't pushed it, right? They haven't pushed this in comic books, and they haven't. And then, the biggest way to get this out there is through TV, through movies, right?
yeah.
That's the biggest push. That's what revived a lot of these comics.
Right, right,
I
right.
mean,
Well, you know what? I just kind of trying to be a student of history a little bit outside, bring it into the bigger world,
mhm.
right? In
Yeah,
1987, La Bamba came out, right, and then that was
that's right.
on the front page of Society. In 1997, the film Selena came out. In
Yes,
2007, George Lopez finished his historic run of the George Lopez Show.
wow.
In 2017, Coco came out. So I wish you great
Hmm.
success. I wish you to be the man in 2027, and hopefully you're right. Hopefully you get a film adaptation because we only seem to ever are ever allowed to be in the front page of Society in a year with a 7 in it. So
Okay. That's good to know. I never like that's a good pattern. So yeah, I'm gonna aim for 2027
yeah,
to have film.
it gives you time. It gives you time to work. That's 7 years.
Yes, yes, to get this out there, right? So
Yeah,
yeah, but this for me is, so I've done a lot of work into this and a lot of research, but also when I go to talk to kids and I go to talk to kids like in housing districts or something, they gravitate toward this. They really do because they don't have this kind of representation out there.
yeah,
And I've even went to talk at like Booker T. Washington High School. It was a high school in like Houston, which is mostly primarily African American kids. They love this because how many, because how many superheroes of color do they have access to? And so I think that there is a desire for these kids to read this stuff, but I mean, we just got to push it. I'm continuing to keep trying to push this stuff, and it's become kind of, it's all consuming because you still got to do your day job.
right, right,
But no, I think that it's necessary, and for me, it's become this crusade to get this out there,
yeah,
and it's a lot of work. I've done a lot of historical work, a lot of work to try to get like because there's a lot of responsibility to telling these stories and also getting history out. So for me, this is what this work is for me.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, this hour has been very illuminating for me. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you taking the time. Where can people find out more about your work, and where can they connect to what you're doing?
So, I mean, I do have a Facebook page for El Vincha, which is my book series. I have a website, which is christophercarmona.com. Um, and it hasn't really been updated since the first book, but I'll get around to it. And I'm on Facebook as well. You can follow me there. And, and also my press, Jade Publishing. They have a couple of book trailers that gives a little bit of the history of the Matanza with historians and stuff. So you can go to Jade Publishing. I think it's jadepublishing.org. I forget exactly their website, but if you look for Jade Publishing and Google it, you'll find it. But just kind of follow me on the major social media stuff, and I'll keep updating when the second book's coming out. Because right now we're looking at spring 2021.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, but thanks for the interview. It's been great.
Yeah, no,
It's been a lot of fun.
thank you for the work you do. I'm really a big fan of the way you are able to bridge like scholarship and artistry. It's a really unique skill set, and that not many people have, and it's to be admired.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for this opportunity.
All right.
All right.